What is happening with Donald Trump and corporate America? One of the most startling developments in US politics in the past few months is the way the heads of some of the world's largest companies have publicly declared their support for the returning president and thrown their organizations behind his agenda. Jeff Bezos, the chairman of Amazon, and Mark Zuckerberg, the founder of Meta Platforms, which owns Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp, are among the tycoons who have publicly bent the knee to Trump and were rewarded with second-row seats at his inauguration. Elon Musk, the world's wealthiest man, supported the Republican candidate's election campaign and has now been given a job in the administration to cut government spending. Many other CEOs have praised Trump and rushed to align themselves with the president, his family, and his associates. This chumminess between companies and politicians may seem like an unusual development. Indeed, outgoing President Joe Biden warned in his final address of the dangers posed by what he called a new oligarchy. But there is a long history of close and at times terse relations between corporate leaders and the US Commander-in-Chief. The oil baron John D. Rockefeller had ups and downs with multiple presidents. John Pierpont Morgan, the banking tycoon, was often consulted by occupants of the Oval Office on financial matters. Henry Ford, founder of the car company, had close relations with several presidents, and even flirted with running for the highest office himself. The question is whether the balance of power between corporations and politicians has somehow shifted. Chief executives are often portrayed as the peddlers of influence, using their power and money to pull the strings of elected officials. But these days, there's also a fear factor. The realization that a president like Trump can affect the fortunes of even very large companies by tilting the playing field in one way or another. The motivations of CEOs are also often a mixture of self-interest and personal ideology. So this week on The Big View, we're going to delve into the relationship between American CEOs and American presidents. It's what we do at Reuters Breaking Views. We tap our best sources around the world to bring you fresh insights into the biggest questions in business, finance, and economics. I'm your host, Peter Thar-Larsen. I'm very pleased to be joined by Tevi Troy. Tevi is a senior fellow at the Ronald Reagan Institute and a former senior White House aide. He's also the author of several books about presidential history. And last year, with exceptional timing, he published a book called The Power and the Money, the epic clashes between commanders-in-chief and titans of industry. It delves into the relationships between business tycoons and presidents over the past 150 or so years. That makes him an ideal candidate to put the current moment in American corporate political power into context. So, Tevi Troy, welcome to The Big View.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for having me.
So I want to spend most of this conversation talking about what is in your book, but I think we have to start by talking about what isn't in your book, because it's happened so recently, which is the early days of the second Trump administration. And we've seen in the last few weeks Elon Musk being brought into the government as the head of Department of Government Efficiency. Apparently, according to reports, he'll have space in the White House. And then we saw Musk standing alongside Tim Cook of Apple and Jeff Bezos of Amazon and other big tech leaders at the inauguration. And Joe Biden, the outgoing president, used his final address to warn that an oligarchy is forming in America that threatens democracy. And so I just wonder if you could maybe, given the research you've done on presidents and business leaders, can you put this into historical context for us? I mean, is this some new era that we've entered into, or are there other periods that we can look back on and say we've seen some of this before?
Right. Well, thanks again for having me to talk about the power of the money. And my book talks about a 150-year history of presidents and CEOs. So in some ways, everything old is new again. But in other ways, there are some new developments that are unusual this time around. All of the characters you mentioned in terms of Zuckerberg and Musk and Tim Cook and their interactions with both Trump and Biden are in my book. The most recent ones are not, because the book came out already. But the point is that these presidents were very aware of these Silicon Valley oligarchs, if you will, and have been working sometimes to have good relationship with them, sometimes not to have good relationship with them. Biden actually went out of his way to say he's not a big fan of Zuckerberg and of Facebook, now Meta. So the relationships between presidents and CEOs is an ongoing story. But what I talk about in The Power of the Money is the way that as government has grown and as the power of these tech companies has grown, there's increased intertwinedness between the two, and government and business are connected because of our enormous regulatory state. And the regulatory state has a lot of impact on these businesses. It doesn't mean that they can't make profits and they can't generate a lot of revenue, because they do. But it does mean that they have to think about government in everything they do, and that sometimes what they're doing is directed towards government ends because of the regulations that shape who they hire, where they can sell their products, what product they can sell, what can they do with their environmental offshoots. So all of that stuff requires CEOs to take government into account, which is why you have these top CEOs who make a real effort to get in with Washington, to get to know presidents, to have their companies viewed more favorably than others.
It's really interesting because when you sort of think about the balance of power, I mean, and I get this a lot when talking to CEOs sort of privately, they are very aware of the power of government to kind of influence their business, shape their businesses, both for good and for bad, and the need to sort of try and maintain influence and sort of get their voice heard. But I think the popular perception would probably be, and maybe fueled by people like Biden talking about oligarchies, is that you've got these big, powerful, wealthy, unaccountable business leaders who are pulling the strings. So, like, how should we think about that?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, they are accountable. They're accountable to their boards of directors and to their shareholders, to public perceptions, to the marketplace. So there is a form of accountability. If they get involved in government, then there's accountability within government. So you talked about Musk possibly having a White House office and a White House email. In that way, he's similar to other White House aides who serve at the pleasure of the president. If they displease the president, they can be gone. We saw Vivek Ramaswamy already has left Doge because of potential disagreements with Musk, maybe with Trump. We don't know for sure. But so there are forms of accountability. The second thing is, I really thought it was a little rich of Biden to talk about oligarchs. What he meant were billionaires he doesn't like, because he was happy to give George Soros, another billionaire who gives money to left-wing causes, he was happy to give him a presidential medal the week before. The other thing is when Facebook was putting its thumb on the scale for the President Obama and Joe Biden's campaign in 2008 and 2012 and sending their own people to work in the administration, he wasn't complaining about oligarchs. So it seems to me he only dislikes oligarchs when billionaires are against him, but he doesn't mind if they're for him.
Yeah, no, that's fair. And I think that idea of sort of companies trying to navigate the political, increasingly partisan politics is something. Maybe we'll come back to that. I want to just come back to this idea of the sort of the growing influence of the state and kind of business leaders having to respond to that. Where would you sort of put the sort of starting point of that? I mean, given the history, the long span of history that you've looked at, when would you say that became a real factor for business leaders?
Well, it's a great question, because initially you had some business leaders who thought they could ignore Washington. They thought that they didn't have to deal with Washington. They could be bigger than Washington, and Washington was just that thing on the side that wasn't something that they had to bother with. And this is what hurt John D. Rockefeller. He builds the biggest company in the world, the dominant player in petroleum and energy in the period between 1870 and 1880, and there's nothing at the time that government can do to lay a glove on him. There's no regulatory state to speak of. There's no Sherman Antitrust Act. There's no legislation. There are no arrows in government's quiver to address it. But over time, government is starting to get more and more powerful, and Rockefeller, to his detriment, ignores that. And so when Teddy Roosevelt's administration comes after Rockefeller's company, he hasn't built up the muscles, if you will, to fight back against government, because he hasn't really thought about this issue very much. And Roosevelt is successful in breaking up Standard Oil. It doesn't happen in Roosevelt's administration. It happens in the administration of Roosevelt's successor, William Howard Taft, when the Supreme Court agrees that the government can do that. But it was something that hit Rockefeller very hard. And he's not the only one. This has happened over the course of the next century. You saw Lou Wasserman, who I talk about in my book, was a Hollywood mogul, thought he didn't have to deal with government. And then Bobby Kennedy's Justice Department comes after him in the John F. Kennedy administration. And suddenly he recalibrates. He says, oh, I better take government into account. And he becomes very close friends with Lyndon Johnson, with Ronald Reagan, with Bill Clinton, because he knows that government is so important to his business. And then you have the case of Bill Gates.
Right.
The last one I'll mention in this particular series. Bill Gates says that the private sector is 3 times faster than government, and the high-tech sector is 3 times faster than the regular private sector. So he's 9 times faster at government. He doesn't have to worry about government. But government may be slower, but they're big. And if they grab you by the ankle, they're not letting go. And so Gates gets burned when the Clinton Justice Department goes after Microsoft. And he's burned so badly that when he meets a young Mark Zuckerberg, he says to him, get an office there now. And by there, he means Washington, D.C.
Yeah, that's really interesting. You sort of see those mistakes being made time and time again, and then shaping what people do afterwards. I mean, is it really sort of as simple to say that if someone like Rockefeller or Bill Gates had sort of paid more attention to this early on, that they could have had a different outcome? I mean, with Rockefeller, you definitely get from your book this sense that this was someone who he wasn't just politically unpopular. He was actually unpopular in the country. Like he just had a bad reputation generally, and that sort of maybe made it possible for Roosevelt and others to attack him and to ultimately break up his company.
You're definitely right that that Rockefeller ignored the PR aspect of this. And look, PR wasn't really a thing then. His company does hire the first PR agent, a guy named Ivy Lee, but that's too late. That's already in the 1900s after all the bad press has hit him. But Rockefeller, even in the 1890s, is saying, let's ignore bad press. It's not something we have to worry about. And he also ignored Ida Tarbell's famous series against him in the early 1900s. He just thought it wasn't something that the company had to deal with. He was focused on making money and building a dominant space within the industry. Well, that's fine, but he ignored what public relations can do to you and also what government can do to you. And the two of them together are a very dangerous combination. So yeah, I think Rockefeller could have handled it differently and things might have worked out better for him. He also might have been, less unethical, less monopolistic, less sharp elbowed. That might have also made a difference. And then similarly, Bill Gates, I think, also could have handled it differently because a guy named Brad Smith comes into Microsoft after Gates leaves, in part because of the way Gates, I think, mishandled the relations with the federal government. And his advice to the company is 2 words. He says, make peace. And that has been Microsoft's watchword ever since. And now they're an even more valuable company than they were when Bill Gates left it.
Yes. No, they definitely, they came back from that and they sort of avoided a breakup in the meantime. I want to talk a bit about ideology and ideological considerations when particularly for some of these business leaders in terms of their political dealings. I mean, you can sort of see quite a few of the examples in your book of people who are just trying to make friends with the right people and sort of and whoever happens to be in power and kind of shift from one to the other. But there are also some characters. I guess I'm thinking particularly of Henry Ford, who seem to have a real agenda in terms of the political influence that they're trying to exert, right? It's not just I'm trying to do good for my business, but Ford was a kind of, for example, a big pacifist. I mean, in the sense that he wanted to keep the U.S. out of World War I and so forth. I mean, how often do you see ideology coming into these relationships?
Well, first of all, I would say that my advice to CEOs is to avoid ideology. Now's not the time to be an ideologue when you're running a big company, and everyone should have in their mind the advice from the great Michael Jordan, who said, Republicans buy sneakers too. You can't pick one side in the ideological divide because the winds change so quickly. Look, we had a Democratic government not that long ago, and now we have a Republican government. And if you went too hard for one side or the other, that could work against you and the interests of your company. So that's my general idea. But yeah, you do see these people who have ideologies. Henry Luce at Time magazine was strongly a Republican, a very patriotic American, and he brought that into his magazine. It didn't work so well when Franklin Delano Roosevelt was president, and he and Roosevelt clashed, and he tried to get Roosevelt defeated in multiple elections, was not successful. Then he goes all in for Eisenhower, and he succeeds in helping get Eisenhower elected. His wife becomes the ambassador to Italy, so there's similarities to the Musk story and somebody who goes all in, uses his platform to help a presidential candidate. But at the same time, he damaged the reputation of his magazine, which was, of course, the source of his power and his wealth, because then Time magazine became seen as too pro-Republican. In fact, there was even a joke that Time magazine is even-handed. Half the time it praises the Republicans, the other half of the time it bashes the Democrats.
Yes, and I think that you have a quote from Luce in the book about him saying, "Well, if you think I'm anything other than a Republican, you haven't been paying attention," or something like that.
That's a great quote. Yeah.
Yeah. No. Just on the sort of the kind of the Roosevelt and the Teddy Roosevelt era and that sort of that trust busting era. I mean, I think it's sort of interesting to think about the conditions that led up to that. Kind of, clearly there was a political unease with growing corporate power for quite a long period of time, which then translated in, as you said, to the Sherman Antitrust Act, and then Roosevelt gets elected. I mean, who becomes president slightly by accident because he's the vice president, and McKinley gets assassinated. And that then leads to this sort of trust busting era. I just wonder. I mean, when you think about the sort of the big tech companies that we have now, one of the things that people talk about is would it be possible to have a similar movement that would actually, kind of rein in some of these big companies, or are they just simply too rich and too powerful and too influential? I just wonder if you could sort of compare and contrast those two periods.
I don't know. I think they are somewhat reined in that they do a lot in service of the government, because that's what the regulatory state is. Again, it doesn't prevent them from making profits or selling their products. It shapes what they do to serve government ends, again, in terms of who they hire and where they do business and what products they sell and what is their use of energy and environmental offshoots. So I think there is a lot of reining in of these companies. Now, there's a limit to what the government can do and still remain within constitutional norms, remain within our democratic republic system, remain a free market. So I think those are important issues. And that's why the antitrust thing, I think, is constantly so interesting and so relevant here. Because if you have a government that takes the Robert Bork approach towards antitrust, which was the dominant view for at least 3 decades in this country, which is you can grow as much as you want as long as there is a benefit to the consumer. If the consumer is still getting better, cheaper products, then it's fine. But if you start using your monopoly to raise prices and harm the consumer, then that's when the government gets involved. In recent years, there's been more of an attitude, the Lena Khan attitude, I would say. She was Biden's head of the FTC. And her attitude was big is inherently bad. And she tried to prevent that. And I think sometimes to the detriment of American companies. I think the Biden administration's move to prevent the merger of Spirit Airlines, for example, I think was a mistake. I think it takes away opportunities from Americans, and it harmed an American company. So I am of the mind that the government should stick to the Bork theory of antitrust, which is as long as it's benefiting the consumer, I'm okay with big.
And so, yes, and obviously Lena Khan also was part of an effort along with the Department of Justice to try and, well, I really sort of challenge some of the big tech companies. I mean, almost, with an agenda, in Google's case of literally trying to sort of, or recommending that it be broken up. I mean, the assumption now is that under Trump, I mean, it's a little bit uncertain because people have different views, but the assumption is that under Trump that will go away. And I guess probably you could look at those 5 tech CEOs sitting in the second row at the inauguration and say, well, that's part of the reason they're there, right? Is to try and avoid that this kind of antitrust effort will continue.
Well, the key word you said in there is try,
right?
Because it's not so clear that all of the elements of the Trump administration are on board with getting away from the Lena Khan approach. Now, Lena Khan will not be in Trump administration, but the ideas that she has about antitrust are shared by some people within the Republican Party. There's a pro-business and an anti-business wing within the Republican Party. I'm not sure I'd call it anti-business, but critical of business. And that has not necessarily been part of the Republican landscape in the recent past. And J.D. Vance is part of that wing, and as is Josh Hawley, the senator from Missouri. And so I think there are going to be some interesting fights within the Trump administration on how they approach big business and whether they use these levers against big business in general, or maybe big businesses that oppose what Trump is trying to do. And so the reason I actually wrote this book, obviously I didn't know that Musk was going to get so involved in a new Trump administration. But what I did see was the growth of the importance of CEOs, but also the development of anti-business ideology on both the Democratic and Republican side. And that's what I thought was interesting. And that's why I thought this was the right moment to write The Power and the Money.
So talk a bit about that then, the sort of anti-business ideology, because you definitely see it, as you say, you see it on both sides, slightly different flavors. But I guess it's probably an open question now, whether a movement like that could really get to the point where it has some real effect on these very big companies in the way that in the way that happened in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Or do you think the conditions now are different?
Well, the conditions are different in that government has a lot more power today.
Mm.
And in fact, I have this appendix in The Power and the Money that shows the rise of the regulatory state and the era in which Rockefeller was operating. I called it the blank slate because there was a lot of white space in which he could do whatever it was he did. You did use his monopolistic practices, build this huge, massive enterprise, a very successful enterprise. But now everything you do, you have to take what government is going to say into account when you're doing it. So government has a lot more power. Now, the Roosevelt era, as you correctly know, was an era in which Republicans, at least some Republicans, were more critical of business. And I would say that pretty much since the 1920s until the 2010s, you could count on the Republican Party as being the pro-business party. But since the 2010s, you've seen a growth of this critical of business element within the Republican Party. The Democrats have long been the party that was more critical of business. And so now you have two parties where there are significant elements that are critical of business. And I think that says a lot for how CEOs are going to have to navigate this environment, not just in the Trump administration, but in subsequent administrations as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Let's talk a bit about partisanship, because there was definitely a period, I guess, particularly in the sort of post-war era, where clearly there were differences between Republicans and Democrats, but there was also quite a lot of overlap in terms of what they thought, and you had some of these CEOs. You talk about Lee Iacocca, the famous business leader, savior of Chrysler. I think he personally knew 11 presidents or something like that. And you kind of had this sense that people could sort of move fairly easily from one side to the other, and sort of, without having to sort of shift direction too much. But it sort of feels like now, if you're a business leader and you're aligning yourself with one party or another, then it gets quite hard when there's a change of direction. You look at Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook, who, in 2020 he's kicking Donald Trump off of Facebook after the January 6th events, and then in 2025 he's sort of shifting very rapidly back towards Trump and sort of appealing to Trump to help him beat up on the Europeans and various other things. So, I guess it's just it's a trickier balancing act, I guess, if you're a CEO trying to keep both sides happy.
Yeah, it is definitely tricky, and it's hard to do. And it's harder to do today when you have the internet and Twitter and long electronic memory of everything you say and do is one aspect of it. But if you look at Lee Iacocca, I think is a really interesting case who you mentioned, who I talk about in The Power of the Money. Iacocca starts in the story as this pro-business, anti-regulation, free market executive at Ford, who goes to the Nixon White House to argue against Ralph Nader-style regulations that the Department of Transportation was trying to impose on the auto industry. And he goes to the Nixon White House to convince them not to go forward with those regulations that the Nixon administration's own Department of Transportation was trying to implement. And he's successful there. But by the time of the mid to late 70s, when Jimmy Carter is president and Chrysler is in trouble and Iacocca is now over there, suddenly he wants a government bailout. And in the 80s, he's all for government tariffs and protectionism to protect American car companies against Japanese cars. And so he has this interesting transition from more conservative to more democratic and more interventionist. And then by the time George W. Bush comes around, he's very dismissive of Bush and the Bush administration aides and is quite critical of them.
One thing I'm curious your views on a bit is influence over media. You mentioned Henry Luce, obviously the founder of Time, a very important figure in many of these presidencies. Later on, obviously, Rupert Murdoch has a lot of influence in U.S. politics. how do you sort of see that evolving um, in terms of the power of the media? And then I guess what's happened more recently is the shift from sort of traditional media to social media. And what we have now, of course, is that some of these leaders who are in business or sorry in technology or in Elon Musk's case, kind of space and cars, but also have a sort of a media platform at the same time. I mean, that seems to be quite unusual that they combine all those things.
Yeah, so there's two things interesting going on here. So first of all, I intentionally included media CEOs in my analysis from The Power of the Money because I think it's important that to look at these things not just as media enterprises, but also as businesses. And these people had business bottom lines to worry about, and that was part of their thinking in how they framed their coverage. The second thing is there's this tendency that I found in the book of big business leaders, even if they're not necessarily in media initially, they purchase platforms so that they can have a say in what's going on. Henry Ford did this with the Dearborn Independent, which unfortunately was an anti-Semitic paper. And then later Musk does this with purchasing Twitter, which is now X. So sometimes these CEOs say, hey, I want to have a say. And they use their power and their influence to purchase those platforms that let them get their word out. And then one interesting person I included in the book, who's kind of a reverse of the model, is Oprah, who she starts with a platform. She starts with a show, and then she uses it to develop her own powerful and large business media enterprise.
So yes, so there's always kind of there's always a double there's always a bit of a game going on where they're straddling the two, right? I mean, it's not purely just about media power. It also sort of tends to lead to other things.
Yeah, look at Rupert Murdoch, who
Yeah.
he comes to power really in the 1970s, although the first White House meeting I have with him is in the 1960s in John F. Kennedy's administration. But
Really?
in the
Wow.
1970s, he makes deals with Democratic politicians
Mm.
to allow him to purchase media platforms in different industries, which was a no-no at the time. You can't have a newspaper and a television station. But he worked with Democratic politicians to cut those deals that enable him to build the powerful empire that he later uses to advance conservative causes.
Yeah.
But he's not just doing it because he's ideologically conservative, but because there's a business opportunity. All of the so-called mainstream media channels, NBC and CNN and MSNBC, they're all to the left. And Murdoch says, there's half the country is conservative. So there's a huge business opportunity if I can just make a media platform that appeals to them. And it's incredibly profitable, much more profitable than the other cable news stations.
So just to talk about Elon Musk for a little bit. I mean, we, you write a bit about some of the early days of Musk when Musk was sort of, getting going with Tesla and various other things, and people may now be surprised to learn that he had a good relationship with Obama. I think you wrote about, Elon Musk in the Obama years endeared himself to Democrats by showing how corporations could serve the interests of a tech and green friendly government. I mean, it's quite hard to imagine now that was ever the case. But sort of he's somehow made this incredible transition.
Yeah, people don't realize this, but Elon Musk never supported a Republican for president in his life until Trump in 2024. He backed Obama in 2012, Hillary in 2016, Biden even in 2020. But a couple of things happened in the interim. First of all, is the massive impact of the regulatory state and the willingness of people like Joe Biden to use his administration with selective enforcement against Musk and his companies. The second thing was Musk's problems with what he calls the woke mind virus that he says drove away one of his children from him who became trans, and now he has no relationship with that child. And then the third thing is, I think, the hyper overreaction to his purchase of X, Twitter, and trying to make it into a free speech platform. And the left, which for so long had been the place where that backs free speech, the backers of free speech, they go crazy over the fact that he's going to drop some of the anti-free speech guardrails on Twitter. And he's, I think, shocked by the level of hyper overreaction against him. And suddenly he's in this position where he says, well, I've been with the Democrats my whole career, and now they hate me. And they really, really hate me beyond all reasonable bounds, it seems. And so it made sense for him to go with Trump from his perspective. And it's not like he was with Trump in 2021. I mean, it was a late breaking development that he joins up with Trump mid to late 2024.
Yeah, well, and now he's now he's addressing, virtually addressing, meetings of the far right German AfD party. I mean, when you see that, it's quite hard to imagine someone like him going back the other way at some point, right? I mean, it does seem like there's been a sort of pretty definitive ideological shift there.
It's hard to imagine, but I didn't imagine him going this far to the right when he was backing Obama and getting green subsidies from the Obama green incentives and working with Obama on SpaceX. So, life is long, and sometimes you see some weird shifts.
Yes, exactly. So, so maybe just to sort of bring this to a close, but I guess one thing I'm sort of interested in is what happens when these relationships go wrong. I mean, clearly you're making the point that the government is very powerful and even more powerful now than in the past. But what can we learn from sort of when presidents and business leaders fall out? Sort of who tends to come off worse?
Yeah, one of the themes I think in The Power of the Money is that when there is a president who has a direct clash with a member of industry or a CEO, the president in that direct clash has an advantage because they have more power at any given moment. But the CEOs I profile in The Power of the Money are all CEOs who spanned multiple administrations, had interactions with multiple presidents. You talked about some who had multiple interactions, like Jack Welch from GE knew 10 different presidents. So over time, the CEO can have more power and influence. But over one discrete moment, it's the president who has the edge. And I think that kind of interaction, that fact that the presidents have the short-term power and the CEOs have the long-term staying power, I think that's what the tension that makes The Power of the Money so interesting.
Yeah, no, it's a really fascinating insight into a lot of these characters and there's some surprising things in there. So it's a really good read and at this particular moment,
thank you.
Particularly topical. So Toby, I just want to say thank you for coming on. It was really really appreciate the conversation, and I'm sure that we will have many more examples to talk about in future.
Thank you so much.
That's all we have time for this week. This podcast was produced by Oliver Tasich in London. You can listen to a new episode of The Big View every Tuesday on the Reuters app or your favorite platform. Don't forget to tune in to our sister podcast, Viewsroom, every Thursday, as well as the other great podcasts from the Reuters team. If you liked what you heard, please follow The Big View and let us know what you thought. And check out our views on the biggest stories in business and finance every day at breakingviews.com and reuters.com.